Can of fish? Can of worms? Kettle of fish? Can of tuna. Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. So for this video I decided to take on a little bit of an unusual challenge, something that I've never really done before, and that is I binged a particular author's entire bibliography. I read, I think, almost everything that they've published, at least everything that I could find relatively easily, either via charity shops or relatives' bookshelves or the internet. So yeah, I think I've done rather well, hopefully. We'll see, I guess. And if you haven't already guessed from the title of this video, this particular author is Sally Rooney, who is incredibly popular, and before taking on this challenge I hadn't actually read a single thing by her, and I know I hear you gasp, how can this booktuber, this bookish content creator, not have read a single thing by Sally Rooney? And I know, it's crazy. To be perfectly honest, I had never really felt any particular desire to read any of her books. I wasn't especially curious at all. I didn't think that I would particularly enjoy them from what I've heard about their kind of writing style and the content in them. But with her having announced her new book coming out later this year, yeah, curiosity finally got the better of me. I finally decided to find out what the hype is all about. So, yeah, I'm making this video to talk about my experience having read all of her books, almost back to back, not entirely back to back. I did read a few other books in between her writing, just to kind of refresh my palette a little bit. So yeah, for this video I am going to start off with talking about all of the books that she's published, everything she's published in kind of a hard copy as kind of an individual novel or story. So those are 4 things, and I'm going to go through them in publication order, which is also the order in which I read them. And then for the second part I'm going to talk about her short stories, which is stuff that she's published in magazines or on the internet, as many as I could kind of find relatively easily. I think, how many are there that I have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 short stories, so probably not all of them that she has ever published, but yeah, as many as I could handle without my brain exploding. And then for the third part I'm going to do an overall ranking of every single thing that I've read by her. So without further ado, let's get started, and we are going to start off with Sally Rooney's debut novel, which is Conversations with Friends. In Conversations with Friends we follow our protagonist Frances, who is 21 years old, and she is a college student at Trinity College Dublin, I think, and the story explores this kind of complex interrelationship between her and 3 other characters. You've got her best friend slash ex-girlfriend Bobby, you've got this journalist Melissa, who her and Bobby meet and are interviewed by one evening, and then you have Melissa's husband Nick, with whom Frances starts an affair. So this novel is very much dedicated to that very complex collection of dynamics between these characters. To me, this book perfectly reflects what it is like to be in your early 20s, and that is essentially making a lot of very bad decisions. These characters are all messy, particularly Frances and Bobby, who are both in their early 20s, and one thing that I have found I really enjoyed about Sally Rooney's writing is her ability to create these very, very flawed, messy characters who aren't especially likeable. They aren't particularly designed to be liked by the reader, but nevertheless they are still very relatable and very sympathetic. Like, you don't necessarily support their decisions, but you understand why they're making them. I think I would find Frances pretty insufferable as a protagonist if I did not relate to her so damn much, and I'm kind of concerned about what that says about me as a person, but you know, that's a whole other can of fish. Can of fish? Is that the saying? Can of worms. Can of worms? Kettle of fish? What is this? What's the saying? I don't know. Let's move on. So yeah, Frances is pretty relatable from her tendency to close off and snap at people and antagonize them instead of being vulnerable when given the opportunity to, all the way to her having a panic attack when thinking about the inevitable heat death of the universe. That is just very relatable. I was reading that and I was like, it me. And I think the relatability of characters like Frances, and especially when these characters are protagonists and the story is told from their point of view, that is what makes books like this so challenging and difficult to read, because these characters take the worst parts of ourselves that we don't necessarily want to face and they just lay those parts out for the world to see. Sally Rooney has a very kind of show don't tell approach to her writing, and that's something that I noticed in every single one of her stories, and I'll probably come back to it when I talk about Beautiful World, Where Are You, because that is, I think, where I noticed it the most. But yeah, she tends to focus on like minute, small details in a scene that really give a lot of kind of vividness and colour to both the scene and the characters in those scenes. I do feel like the book could have been a little bit shorter because it lost a little bit of steam in the final chapters, and that's not to say that I didn't enjoy the content of the final chapters, and it's gonna be a little bit of a brief spoiler warning for the next little bit. I'll put a timestamp below if you want to skip to the next little bit and avoid any spoilers if you haven't read this book already. But I did really enjoy the content of the final chapters. I really liked this kind of idea of this kind of queer platonic relationship that Frances and Robbie had formed. I think relationships like that are quite underrepresented in fiction, especially like literary fiction that isn't explicitly targeted towards LGBTQ audiences. So yeah, their relationship that kind of blurred the lines between friendship and something more was really, really interesting to read and very cool. But I do think that the pacing kind of wound down in the final chapters, so I don't know, maybe it could have been condensed a little bit. Yeah, overall content very good, pacing something to be desired. Overall, I really enjoyed this. I think mostly because I found Frances so relatable, and it was very interesting to read a character like her. But yeah, very good. I gave it 4.5 stars. Okay, moving swiftly on, we have Normal People, and I'm gonna sound really stupid here, but I honestly thought that this was Sally Rooney's debut novel and not Conversations with Friends. Yeah, I think you can tell that I'm complete newbie to this. But yes, I did end up reading them in publication order completely by chance. Like Conversations with Friends was just the first one that I picked up, and then I realized it was the debut and I was like, oh, I can do something with this. Okay, Normal People. I don't think this needs any explanation, but if you are like I used to be, living under a rock, not really knowing what this book was about, other than there are two characters called Connell and Marianne, because that was pretty much all I knew about this book. That is actually about it about this book. There are two characters called Connell and Marianne, and yeah, they kind of keep getting drawn together. They grew up together, weren't particularly friendly with each other until they hit their teens, and then they couldn't be apart from each other, essentially. They they've got this very complicated relationship that develops, and we watch it develop over the course of several years as they grow up, leave school, go to university. Yeah, it's very much kind of on and off, will they won't they kind of relationship. Okay, I'm going to start with the good things. I found both Marianne and Connell very, very interesting to read as individual characters. I thought Connell's struggle with his mental health was very well executed. It was quite relatable. Again, I don't know what that says about me as a person, that I found it relatable, but again, a whole other can of tuna. I also thought that Marianne's tendency to seek out toxic friendships and relationships outside of the house, as caused by her abuse at home, was very interesting to read, and how that might have altered her as a person. I liked that although Marianne was a victim, very much so, she is not kind of painted as pathetic or completely faultless because of being a victim of abuse. Like, she is a pretty independent character. She makes mistakes that are her own, and not anyone else's. She has her own personality and her own flaws, and I liked that her personality wasn't just, oh, she is a victim of abuse and that's it. Like, she is very much a multifaceted character, which I think was very well done. However, and we're going to move on to the negatives now, I do think that the actual relationship between Connell and Marianne was the dullest part of the book, which is a shame because it's, you know, pretty much the focus of the entire book. If you spent any time on my YouTube channel at all, you will know how much I despise the miscommunication trope. And I knew that there was a lot of miscommunication in this book, but I thought, you know, it might be really well executed and I might actually enjoy it this time. But I've come to realise that no matter how well executed miscommunication is, and I'm not denying this is a very well written book because it is a very well written book, yeah, miscommunication just frustrates me no matter how well written it is. The whole idea of writing about two characters whose lives are so intimately tangled together, and no matter how bad they might be for each other, they just can't keep away from each other, that's a really, really intriguing idea. But when their relationship ends up just being like this cycle of them drifting together, having a nice time for a little bit, and then having some kind of miscommunication that leads them to breaking up, and that happens over and over and over again, it gets old pretty quickly. And it ended up being that my frustration at these two characters for not talking to each other like adults, that just ended up overshadowing everything else that I was feeling about this book, both positive and negative. So yeah, I really wanted to enjoy it. It's the thing. I went into this wanting to enjoy it. You know, it's so, there's so much hype surrounding it. I know so many people who absolutely love this book, but yeah, it just wasn't for me, which was disappointing. So that was Normal People, and I ended up giving this one 3.5 stars. Again, it's a very well written book. It is very well written. I'm not denying that, but yeah, it just wasn't really for me. Okay, after that, I very quickly whizzed through this one because it is literally 32 pages long. I read Mr. Salary, which is a short story that Sally Rooney published for Faber Stories. This is a really brief insight into the relationship between two characters. You've got Suki, who I want to say is in her early 20s, and Nathan, who is a friend of her father's and whose apartment she is currently living in with him. And despite their age difference, because it is quite an age difference, I can't remember off the top of my head how old these characters are, but it is quite a big age gap. Despite this, Suki absolutely adores Nathan. She loves him so much, and they end up having this kind of will they, won't they kind of relationship, where it's quite clear that both of them are at least attracted to each other. Like Nathan is, at least, like, he does kind of somewhat fancy Suki, at least, but he's definitely holding himself back because, I guess, of that age difference. Again, my favourite part of the story was the writing style. I thought it was really impressive how Sally Rooney was able to create such clear impressions of these characters, just from, you know, very few words, and just some of the descriptions of Suki's love for Nathan. It's all from Suki's perspective, and you can so clearly see this kind of adoration of Nathan from her, just from the way that Sally Rooney is writing, and the descriptions are just so great. But as for the actual content of the story, reading it felt like watching a car crash, in that you know that this relationship is going to end in disaster, but you physically cannot look away. Again, I can't remember off the top of my head just how big the age gap is, but considering Nathan is, I think, a friend or perhaps a brother-in-law maybe of Suki's father, yeah, the age gap is pretty big, and it felt a little bit uncomfortable for me personally. So yeah, overall, I really like the writing style. I feel like because this story is so short, it could potentially be something that I will come back to in the future. Yeah, 3.75 stars. Hello, we're back. I ran out of time to film this afternoon because I had to go to a rehearsal, but I just wanted to finish up this first part of the video real quickly by talking about Beautiful World, Where Are You? So this book, for the most part, is told in kind of like 3 parts that alternate chapter by chapter. So firstly, you've got Alice, who is a novelist who has just moved into a house in a tiny little village in rural Ireland, and she meets a guy called Felix off of Tinder, and their first date goes horribly. They kind of know pretty much immediately that they don't particularly like each other that much, but strangely they still can't keep away from each other, and yeah, they're still kind of drawn to each other somehow, and their relationship kind of progresses from there. And then you also have Alice's best friend Eileen, who is living in Dublin, and she starts this kind of friends with benefits type arrangement with Simon, who is a childhood friend of hers and whom she has always had a little bit of a crush on. And yeah, as you might expect, it gets pretty messy pretty quickly. And then the third part of this book, after every chapter you get a part of an email correspondence between Alice and Eileen, because they're long distance best friends and they communicate over emails to each other, which are quite long and introspective and quite wordy. But yeah. And then in kind of the last 100 pages or so, all 4 of these characters unite. They all come together in Alice's house, and yeah, the plots from there. I really loved the exploration of friendship in this book. While a lot of it is focused on the relationships between Alice and Felix and Eileen and Simon, it's really brought together by this very deep friendship that Alice and Eileen have over this, first the email correspondence, and then once they finally reunite in person. There is a little bit of this book that I want to read to you, which is the moment that the 2 best friends reunite, and I just thought it was so beautiful. Okay. On the platform of a train station, late morning, early June, 2 women embracing after a separation of several months. Behind them, a tall, fair-haired man alighting from the train, carrying 2 suitcases. The women unspeaking, their eyes closed tight, their arms wrapped around one another. For a second, 2 seconds, 3. Were they aware, in their intensity of their embrace, of something slightly ridiculous about this tableau, something almost comical, as someone nearby sneezed violently into a crumpled tissue, as a dirty, discarded plastic bottle scuttled along the platform under a breath of wind, as a mechanised billboard on the station wall rotated from an advertisement for hair products to an advertisement for car insurance, as life in its ordinariness and even ugly vulgarity imposed itself everywhere all around them? Or were they in this moment unaware, or something more than unaware? Were they somehow invulnerable to, untouched by vulgarity and ugliness, glancing for a moment into something deeper, something concealed beneath the surface of life, not unreality, but a hidden reality, the presence at all times, in all places, of a beautiful world? And I just thought that was stunning. And I mean, when I moved home from university, I went to university across the country, and when I moved home, I ended up having a lot of friends that I went quite a while without seeing, and literally hugging a long distance friend after a long time spent away from each other, even though you may be messaging each other every day, like seeing them in person and being able to hug them is just such a special feeling. And I think that paragraph perfectly encapsulates that. And yeah, I did tear up a little bit reading that. Another thing I have noticed is that I think I tend to prefer Sally Rooney's books that place female friendship, especially at the foreground of the book. Like Conversations with Friends has that friendship between Frances and Bobby, and that is a very deep friendship. It kind of crosses over a little bit into something more than friendship. And then in this book you have the friendship between Alice and Eileen, and while there is romance going on with both those books do kind of centre on that female friendship. And yeah, I just think Sally Rooney writes it so fantastically. And yeah, a lot of people do go on about kind of the romance in Normal People, but I think her depictions of friendship is really where Sally Rooney shines. Another thing that I really enjoyed about this book was the narration style. It's told by this kind of distant third person narrator. It's not quite an omniscient narrator, but it's definitely not a close third person narrator. It's kind of like this voice of an observer into these four people's lives, and it's kind of this distant, almost clinical narrative voice that focuses less on the characters' thoughts and feelings and more on their actions and how those actions imply what thoughts and feelings those characters might be having. I thought it was really, really well executed, and I was very impressed by how well it was executed. Also, another thing that I noticed was that as these books have been going on, this narrative voice, this narration has been getting more and more distant. Like Conversations with Friends, that was first person narration. It was told from the perspective of Frances. With Normal People, it was this close third person narration that alternated between Connell and Marianne, and it gave an insight into both of those characters' thoughts and feelings. With this novel, it's a much more distant voice that doesn't really give that insight into their thoughts and feelings, but tells the story in a completely different way. And that just makes me really curious as to what the narration style might be like for Sally Rooney's new novel. Is it going to be something completely experimental? Is it going to be similar to the narration style of one of the other books? I don't know. We'll have to see. One thing I will say is that it took me a while to really get into this book. It felt very slow paced. It was very slow paced. It doesn't have that much of a plot. Particularly, I would say the plot kind of starts plotting in the last 100 pages when the characters all unite. It is very much a no plot, just character study type book. And another thing is that the paragraphs can be so long, really, really long. Like, you can turn a page and there's still no paragraph break. And for me personally, that makes it quite hard for me to follow a book. Like, sometimes my eyes will just start looking at the words but not actually reading them, and I get halfway down the page and I'm like, what has happened? Because I haven't taken any information in, so I have to skip back up to the top of the paragraph and then read that whole thing again. So yeah, that I found that happening quite a lot with this book, but I am super glad that I stuck with it. Yeah, overall I had a good time. Yeah, I rated it 4.25 stars. Hello, it is the next day. It got to like 11 p.m. as I was filming that last bit, and yeah, I just decided to go to bed and start again in the morning. I was really hoping to get this entire video done in one go, but life happens, as it has a tendency to do. So let's talk short stories. I am not counting Mr. Salary in this kind of section of the video because that was kind of published as its own short story individually in its own physical copy. But yeah, the 5 other short stories that I read I found on the internet. There are 5 to get through, and I'm gonna quickly go through them and review them. Yeah. So firstly we have Concord 34. This is a story about a character called Miriam, who is our narrator. She is in her mid-20s. She lives on the beach. She is in a long-term but unhappy relationship with her boyfriend, who is a lot older than her, and they started dating when I believe she was 16 years old and he was significantly older. So yeah, that happened. She herself is not particularly happy. She has quite a few mental health issues. She has a tendency to stay at home and isolate herself. And over the course of this short story, she herself begins an affair with a 16-year-old boy who is the cousin of one of her friends. I thought it was an interesting and nuanced description of this cycle of abuse that quite often happens with these kinds of relationships when someone is a victim of grooming at a young age. They can sometimes, not always, sometimes fall into also grooming someone else, becoming a perpetrator of that, because that is just what they have been led to believe is normal. I thought it was well written, as I so often do with Sally Rooney's stories. The actual content of it I did find kind of uncomfortable to read, but I guess that's sort of the point, I guess, is that the relationships depicted in the story are, you know, they're messy and uncomfortable, I guess. So that is Concord 34. The next story I read was At the Clinic, which is, I believe, Connell and Marianne's first appearance before Normal People was even kind of conceived as a book. This short story was written, and then those 2 characters were expanded into the novel Normal People. So I believe the 2 characters are 23 years old in this short story, and the story is about Connell taking Marianne to a dentist appointment. I actually, interestingly, really enjoyed this story. I think this is going to be a little bit of a spicy take, but I do find that this kind of dynamic between Marianne and Connell does really lend itself quite well to short form fiction. You get everything that you need to know about the characters, and not all of it is described in explicit detail. Quite a lot of it is very much inferred, and I really like the fact that Sally Rooney doesn't underestimate the intelligence of her audience. Like, again, this is something I found in all of her writing. She does quite often leave details that are more implicit in the text and left for the readers to discover for themselves, just from reading and thinking about the text. And I think this is more clearly seen in her short stories, because you get a lot of information that is just condensed into very few pages, and it is then up for the reader to digest that information and come to their own conclusions. Also, as an aside, crying after a dentist appointment because you feel like absolute shit is so relatable. Last time I went to a dentist, I had 2 fillings done and I was literally in bed for 2 days because of the pain. Like, it's rough. I hate the dentist. So yeah, that was at the clinic. I really enjoyed it. I think most people who are fans of Normal People will have probably read it already, but if you haven't, then yeah, you should read it, because you get all of that insight into Connell and Marianne's characters and their relationships to each other without the seemingly endless cycle of misunderstanding and the frustration that comes with reading that. Next we have Even If You Beat Me, which is a story about debating. Essentially, we follow our unnamed narrator and her experience with debating competitions. She starts doing debating at school and she becomes really, really good at it, and kind of the moment she becomes like European champion of debating, I think it's European champion, but yeah, she does really, really well, and then the moment she wins this kind of top competition is the moment that she retires from debating completely. This short story is probably super enjoyable for people who like debating or have experience with debating competitions. That's not me, so I feel like I wasn't the intended audience for this, and as a result, I probably didn't get as much out of it as people who are fans of debating or have done it in the past. There were some really interesting points made about women in debating and how it's quite a male dominated field, and whether that's because men just in general have a tendency to talk over women or make their points heard and listened to more than women do. And like, there have been studies about that whole thing, like the gender imbalance with just like not even debating but just discussions in general. Men do tend to make themselves heard a lot more often than women do. And also the narrator does very much give off burned out gifted kid vibes, and I say that as a burned out gifted kid, so I feel like she could be pretty relatable again to people who know more about debating than I do. There were also quite a few unanswered questions left at the end of the story, and not in the sense of like it's a short story that leaves you wanting more, it's more in the sense of it's a short story that just kind of ended. Like, the story starts with the narrator going to India to guest judge a competition, a debating competition, and she's a little bit older. She stopped debating as a competitor quite a while ago, but she still gets invited to like guest judge competitions, and she's going to India, and she is on her way there when she witnesses this accident happen. Like, something happens and it's not explained, which is kind of frustrating, but it's kind of very heavily implied that it shakes everyone up a little bit, everyone who kind of witnesses it or is involved in it. But yeah, we never actually hear about, you know, what actually happened with that accident or what happened with the competition that the narrator is traveling to. Instead, it just skips to the past of the narrator and just going through like her experience in the past as a teen, going to these debating competitions and actually competing. And I just thought it potentially would have been better if it had returned to like the present day and explained some of those unanswered questions, because otherwise what is really the point of even starting there to begin with? I don't know, those are just my thoughts. So that was Even If You Beat Me. And then moving on, we have a story with a very long title. It is Robbie Brady's astonishing late goal takes its place in our personal histories, which I believe is a headline, potentially taken from a newspaper. So this story takes place just after Ireland wins a match in the 2016 Euros, I'm pretty sure. And yeah, that is where that headline comes from. And you've got two characters, and it's a phone call between the two of them. You've got Connor, who went to actually watch the match. I'm pretty sure it's in Italy, but I could be wrong. And then Helen, who is watching back home. And yeah, it's a phone call between those two characters. And yeah, it was short, sweet, romantic. Yeah, it was a very sweet short story. A very unusual happy ending for a Sally Rooney story. Those don't happen often. And yeah, I don't really know what else to say about the story. I enjoyed it, but the thing is, it felt a little bit too short. And as a result, I just don't really have any intelligent thoughts to kind of talk about for it. Like, it was sweet. Will I be thinking about it a lot in the future? Probably not. It will not be living rent-free in my brain. But yeah, it was very cute and a good way to spend 15 minutes of my life. And then the final short story I read Colour and Light, which was published in the New York Times. So in this story, we follow our protagonist Aidan, who meets Pauline, who is a friend of his brother's. She's quite an intriguing character. They form a little bit of a connection over several meetings over time, and yeah, things happen. One of the scenes in which they meet and talk to each other is this fireworks show that happens down on the beach, and that was my favourite scene in the short story. I thought the descriptions of the fireworks and everyone watching them, and Aidan watching Pauline watching the fireworks, I thought those descriptions were really gorgeous. I'm pretty sure that is where the title Colour and Light comes from. There were some really nice lines, some really beautiful writing. However, again, my issues come down to the ending of the story. The ending felt really abrupt. It felt a little bit like maybe Sally Rooney was approaching the word limit and she wasn't quite sure how to end it. That is just my opinion, but yeah, to me, it just felt like the story just kind of ended without any closure or any kind of, you know, satisfying conclusion. And like, short stories don't necessarily need to have satisfying conclusions, but they do need to have conclusions, at least. So that was Colour and Light. And yeah, those were the 5 short stories that I read by Sally Rooney. So that is everything that I read by Sally Rooney over the last 2 or 3 weeks. I am just going to end this video with a little bit of a conclusion, my findings, sounds like an experiment, and yeah, a ranking of everything that I read by her. So yeah, overall, I really liked the writing of the books. The writing style was really good, very lyrical. Yeah, I didn't think that I would enjoy it as much as I did, just from stuff that I have heard about her writing. The whole not including quotation marks in, like, for speech and stuff, that didn't really bother me as much as I thought it would. The only place where it kind of annoyed me was Beautiful World, Where Are You? Just because of those really long paragraphs, and the paragraphs didn't always break when, like, a different person started talking, so it took a minute sometimes to remember who actually is talking, and when. I particularly enjoyed her depictions of friendship, especially female friendship. That seemed to be an overarching theme of the 2 novels of hers that I really enjoyed. And again, as I said, I like the fact that she doesn't underestimate the intelligence of her readers. Like, her style of writing is very much show don't tell, and she, rather than talking explicitly about what the characters might be thinking or feeling, she has a tendency more to describe their actions, and then she leaves it up to the audience, the readers, to infer from those descriptions what the characters might be feeling. And again, she just has this very impressive ability to create very flawed, very messy characters who, you know, they make bad decisions. You don't necessarily agree with what they're doing, but they are still very sympathetic, and you kind of understand why they might be doing what they're doing, what has led them to that behaviour in the first place. Her stories very much prioritise character over plot, and the fact that she's able to create such three-dimensional characters means that the stories don't end up being incredibly boring, even though they don't really have much of a plot. So my overall ranking of everything that I have read by Sally Rooney for this video, let's get into it. So in 9th place we have Even If You Beat Me. Yeah, I just don't think I was particularly the target audience for this story, as someone who doesn't know a thing about debating, and the ending left quite a few unanswered questions, which left me as a reader quite unsatisfied. In 7th place we have Normal People. Yeah, the Sally Rooney stans are going to attack me for this one, I am sure. But yeah, it wasn't for me. It's a very well written book, I'm not going to deny that, but I just found all the miscommunication very frustrating, personally. In 7th place is Concord 34. Again, very well written, but the relationships depicted in the story were just a little bit uncomfortable to read for me. 6th place, Robbie Brady's Astonishing Late Goal. Short, sweet, a little bit too short potentially. In 5th place is Colour and Light. I especially loved the descriptions of the fireworks scene. And in 4th place is Mr. Salary. Again, very well written. It was a well written depiction of a very messy but inevitable relationship. And now we come to our top 3. In 3rd place we have At the Clinic, which will probably come as quite a surprise considering how low I ranked Normal People, but I do feel like Conlon Marianne's dynamic lends itself really well to short form fiction, and I really enjoyed that snippet, that little brief insight into their lives and their relationship. In 2nd place I have got Beautiful World, Where Are You? There was a lot that I really enjoyed about this book. I loved the depiction of long distance friendship. I loved the narration style. I thought it was really interesting and really well executed. I don't know if it was just because this was the last thing that I read chronologically for this video, but this book in particular got me really, really excited to read her new novel that is coming out later this year. And in our top spot we have Conversations with Friends, Sally Rooney's debut novel. Even though this was the first book that I read for this video, I read it and I understood the hype surrounding Sally Rooney. Like, I found Frances very relatable. I understand why so many of Sally Rooney's characters can be relatable to so many people. This very messy dynamic between Frances and Bobby and Melissa and Nick was, I think, very well written. All 4 of those characters were three-dimensional and, you know, had their own motivations, and yeah, I found it very enjoyable to read. So that was my ranking, and that brings us to the end of this video. Will I be reading Intermezzo when it comes out? I will be reading it, definitely, but I might potentially wait until it comes out in paperback, just so that I can add it to this little collection of paperbacks. Thank you so much for watching, especially if you have got to this point in the video. If you enjoyed it, please remember to give it a like, Subscribe to my channel if you want to see more of this stuff. I can be found on Instagram, TikTok, Storygraph. My username is @WithLivJones. If you want to see more bookish content from me on other platforms. Thank you so much again for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!